Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sir Franz, and I hope at this point in time, in your learning of anatomy and physiology, you are still quite interested in the human body. So ngayon, even in my um, 10 years or more of learning about the human body, I'm still at awe and I'm still wanting to learn more. There are still so many things that I have yet to discover about our body. So with this lecture, sana andun pa yung fire. And right now, patapos na tayo. We are already in the last term of our semester. And our topic for this afternoon would be the gastrointestinal tract. And later on, in the future lessons, we'll be talking about the endocrine system. Okay, so right now, we'll be learning about the gastrointestinal tract. Its relevant and basic anatomy and its functions as it applies into your further learning of how the drugs work and how the different diseases come about. So this will be our outline of discussion. We'll be starting with the mouth, and then we'll be ending with the large intestines. So at this point in time, I hope you understand that the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary tract spans from the mouth down to the anus. No? Yung daluyan ng pagkain, that is the entire alimentary tract. So that is better illustrated in this image. So again, the alimentary tract starts from the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, large intestines, the rectum, then the anus. So as you can observe here, the entire alimentary tract is actually a long tube, but in communication with that long tube, you have accessory structures, which in essence provide secretions that aid in the digestion and absorption of our food stuff. Okay, so these accessory structures are technically solid, no? But some of them will also have tubular structures. So that includes the liver. And later on, as you learn more about the particular anatomy of the liver, you will understand that it has this biliary system where the secretion, which is bile, flows through and enters the small intestines. So you have here the green structures, no? They're colored green, and this is the extrahepatic biliary tree, no? Which includes the gallbladder, the common bile duct, and you have here another solid structure which associates with the duodenum, the pancreas. And it also has its own tubular structures where its secretions called pancreatic juice flows, okay, and enters the duodenum. Okay. So again, what are the components of our alimentary tract? The mouth, the pharynx, which feeds into the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, which in essence are composed of three portions which are continuous with each other: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And then you have the large intestines, which are composed of the ascending colon, transverse colon, because it goes transversely, descending colon, pababa na siya, and then you have the sigmoid colon, which is letter S in shape, and it's quite long. Then you have the rectum, which means straight, no, rectum. Then you have the anus and the anal canal. So first, let's talk of the more proximal portion of the alimentary tract, which is the mouth. So here, which is a picture from your book, is shown a medial portion or a sagittal section of the mouth and the structures of the head and the neck. Okay, so starting from the top, this is your nasal cavity. Okay, and this is the nares or the opening of the nose. As you will observe, the nasal cavity is actually connected to the oral cavity, okay, through this structure. And this is what you call the uvula. Okay, so if you open your mouth, the uvula will look like this one. So that means posterior and superior to the uvula, you will already encounter your nasal cavity. The connection of the nasal cavity with the oral cavity is through the nasopharynx, which is this one. So think of it this way. The pharynx is basically the throat, okay? And the throat has superior, middle, and inferior portions. The more superior portion of the throat is the nasopharynx. The middle portion, which is in the same level as your mouth, is the oropharynx. And the inferior portion, which is at the level of the voice box or the larynx, is what you call the laryngopharynx. Okay, so this is the entire pharynx. This one up to downwards. And then more inferiorly, the pharynx will already be converted or transformed into the esophagus. Okay, so next you have here the oral cavity, which is just basically the space of the mouth. Okay, you have here the labia or the lips. You can see here the teeth. The teeth, again, is connected to two skeletal structures in the head. And that would be the maxilla, where the upper teeth are connected, and you have here the mandible, where the lower teeth are connected. Okay, so this is your maxilla, and these are your maxillary teeth. No? So in front view, this is the maxillary teeth, and inferiorly, you will have the mandibular teeth. Okay, so it's basic, no, that the teeth is important for comminution, which is the decrease in the particle size of the food. So you have two forms of teeth. You have here the centrally located incisors, no? So yung incisors natin, they are specialized for cutting. And you have the more laterally and posteriorly oriented molar teeth. So yung molar teeth naman, as you will observe, they are more flat, no? And they are larger in body. So because of that structure, it is more specialized for grinding the function ng chewing. Okay, so cutting for the incisors and grinding for the molars. Okay, so here is your tongue. As you will observe, the tongue is actually not just this structure that you will see here, but it has inferior and more muscular portions. Okay, so what I'd like to highlight is the act of swallowing. Okay, is the act of swallowing. So the act of swallowing is actually a complex process that is coordinated by the central nervous system. So kailangan kapag ikaw ay nagsaswallow, yung food should not reach the airways. So as you will observe here, in the inferior portions, no, of the pharynx and the neck, you will see that anteriorly, you will find the airway, and posteriorly, you will find the esophagus. This is where the food travels. And this is where the air travels. So dapat meron kayong anatomic separation of the two. However, in the laryngopharynx, you will observe that there is still a shared space for both food and air. So every time you swallow, there should be physical separation of the food, and it should not travel into the airway, or else you will have aspiration. Okay, and that aspiration will carry with it microbes, which will lead to infection of the airways. So again, there should be separation, and that separation is afforded by the epiglottis. So how does swallowing occur? Your tongue should go up, okay? Your soft palate, which contains the uvula, should go up and close this portion. So the tongue should go up, the uvula should go up and backwards to physically separate the nasopharynx from the oropharynx. Okay, and the tongue, after it goes up, should push the food backwards. So it goes up and backwards. So that will now push the food into this portion, the oropharynx. And later on, the epiglottis should go down and close off this portion so that the food that is in the oropharynx will now have a conduit or a particular area of transfer, which is already the laryngopharynx. So magko-close ito, and this will cut off connection to the trachea, and therefore food will now go down the esophagus. So that is a highly coordinated neurologic process, so that if you have stroke that affects particularly the brain stem, which controls this process, our stroke patients will have a higher risk of aspiration. So what's special about the mouth is you have there the salivary glands, no? So in the mouth, you have three major salivary glands. One will be the parotid gland, which is located here laterally. And then you have another gland here, which is the submandibular gland, and another gland beneath the tongue, which is the sublingual gland. So you will better observe that in this picture, sa simula. You have here the parotid gland, no, which swells when you have mumps. You have here the submandibular gland, which is inferior and medial to the mandible. Kaya siya tinawag na submandibular, sa ilalim ng mandible. Then you have the sublingual gland, which is underneath the tongue. So these glands will secrete saliva, which has the function of lubrication and which has the function of initial digestion of starch through the component amylin. No? So that amylase is an enzyme which degrades starch, no? So that that long carbohydrate, which is starch, will be converted into smaller units, which is the primary goal of digestion. So yung goal kasi ng digestion would be to make the food bolus smaller and smaller, and eventually to perform hydrolysis of the bonds that connect the components of your food stuff. No? So for example, starch is a carbohydrate. It's a polysaccharide. And eventually, starch will have to be hydrolyzed into individual glucose units. And that will be the one that is absorbed, the glucose units. So here in the mouth, as function of your saliva, which is produced by the salivary glands, that saliva contains amylase, which will start the digestion of polysaccharides or carbohydrates in the mouth. Okay, so here you have a simplified illustration of the microscopic structure of your salivary glands. So here on top would be your acinar units. No? So ito yung mga acinos natin. These grape-like structures or acinar units or acinus are composed of cells that create the secretion, which is called your primary secretion. It's not yet called saliva. In this portion, kung saan nagsisimula yung secretion, it's still called primary secretion. It secretes thiolin, which is your amylase, mucus, and extracellular fluid. So again, remember your lesson in the cardiovascular system that the extracellular fluid, the fluid surrounding the cells, the fluid bathing the cells, is technically similar to plasma, which is the liquid component of blood. So anong ibig sabihin nito? The primary secretion is similar to plasma. No? And this secretion flows along the tubule of the salivary gland. No? So habang dumadaan siya sa tubule, it is continuously modified. No? The tubular cells that you will find here will continuously modify your secretion. It will cause absorption of sodium, absorption of chloride, secretion of potassium, and secretion of bicarbonate, so that the end product, no, as the primary secretion flows through the tubule, will be saliva. So that saliva will now contain low levels of sodium, low levels of chloride kasi na-reabsorb na siya, high levels of potassium, and high levels of bicarbonate. Okay? So that is the characteristic of your saliva. And again, the important portion of saliva for digestion would be your thiolin. So can you imagine what is happening right now? Your food is being chewed in the mouth. So yung food bolus will now be comminuted to smaller portions, but at the same time, it will be bathed in saliva. And the thiolin in saliva has now started to digest the carbohydrate, which is starch. Now, the food that has gone through the pharynx has now reached the esophagus. So the esophagus will now be a muscular tube that is like the pharynx and the mouth, continuous with the rest of the alimentary tract. So what's simple and easy to understand about the alimentary tract is that the layers of the wall of this tubular structure is similar. No? Meron silang basic structure that will just be modified as you go more distal the alimentary tract. So ulitin ko, it's a tubular structure from mouth to anus. And that tubular structure has wall. No? That wall will have similar components all throughout the alimentary tract. Okay, so let's start from the outside portion. So this is the covering of the alimentary canal. No? The outermost covering is called the peritoneum. So this peritoneum is made up of connective tissue. No? It's made up of collagen. It's tough. Okay, so that is the visceral peritoneum. And later on, as we go into the intestines, you will see that this visceral peritoneum is actually connected to still a connective tissue rich structure, which we call the mesentery. And this mesentery will then connect the viscera into the walls of the abdomen. Okay, so siya yung parang anchor. The mesentery will anchor the abdominal viscera, no? The stomach and the small intestines and the large intestines onto the side walls of your abdomen. So because of that, we haven't got structural support for the viscera. But at the same time, the mesentery will conduct into the viscera nerves, arteries, and veins so that you have blood supply to the viscera. So yung mesentery dyan ay eto lang, no? Yung covering lang. Inside it will be your nerve, artery, and vein. Okay? And as you will observe, the mesentery will come in contact with the actual tubular structure and then fan out, no, into the visceral peritoneum. So that's the outermost layer, the peritoneum. Peritoneum is connective tissue in structure. The next layer, as you go inwardly, would be the muscular layer. No? So the muscular layer is this one. You have an outer longitudinal layer, which is yung muscle noon is oriented along parallel to the axis of the organ. So for example, if you have this one, this is your small intestine, and this is the orientation of the small intestine. No? Your outer longitudinal muscle will be oriented parallel to the axis. So pag ganun yung takbo ng muscle, it's longitudinal. No? And it is the first muscle that you encounter if you enter the small intestines going to the inside. So from the outside going to the inside, the first muscle that you will encounter will be the outer longitudinal muscle. No? So the next layer of muscle that you will encounter will be the inner circular muscle. So from outside, peritoneum, outer longitudinal, and then inner circular. Okay, so this inner circular muscle, if this is your small intestine and you look at it from the inside, will be oriented circularly. Okay, so remember, these are muscles. Ibig sabihin, nagko-contract sila. So if they contract, the outer longitudinal muscle will contract this way. No? And it will shorten the length of your small intestine, of your stomach, of your large intestine. So it will contract this way. Yung inner circular muscle, because it is oriented circularly, it will contract this way. No? It will decrease the size of the lumen. Okay, so later on, as we go into propulsion, and as we discuss peristalsis, you will have to understand the structure and how it contracts. Okay. Then after the muscle layer, you will now encounter the submucosa. Okay, which is this one. So ito yung outer longitudinal, inner circular, and then this is your submucosa. No? Submucosa means siya ay nasa ilalim ng mucosa. And the lining, which faces the lumen, is already called your mucosa. So you have 4 layers. From outside to inside, you have the peritoneum, muscle, submucosa, and mucosa. The muscle layer is further composed of the outer longitudinal and the inner circular muscle layer. Okay, So that would be the 4 layers of the alimentary canal. Okay, from esophagus to stomach to small intestine to large intestine, you will see these 4 layers. So here, this is an illustration showing to us peristalsis. So again, peristalsis is involuntary. No? Once you have swallowed the food, that is partly voluntary. Na nakokontrol mo pa yun yung pag-swallow. But as it reaches the middle portion and the distal portion of your esophagus, the muscular contraction all throughout, no, up to the anus, will already be involuntary. Hindi mo na nakokontrol yun. So that peristalsis is rhythmic and it's involuntary. Peristalsis means movement from the mouth ab-orad, no? So away from the mouth. No? Okay, so that movement again is involuntary. It's ab-orad. No? Ibig sabihin, it moves away from the mouth. So we have here a particular law, no, which we call the law of the gut. Gut means gastrointestinal tract. So you have the law of the gut, which states that peristalsis occurs ab-orally, away from the mouth, and it occurs in a particular pattern. No? You have here the proximal portion, and you have here the distal portion of the tube. And this is your food bolus, yung green. Ito yung pagkain na sinwallow mo. Proximal to the food bolus, you will have contraction. Okay? So again, this is performed by the inner circular muscle. Distal to the food bolus, there should be relaxation. Okay? So ang tawag natin dyan is receptive relaxation. Proximal to the food bolus, contraction. Distal to the bolus, relaxation. So this will contract, and progressively the contraction or the contractile ring will move proximal to distal. Okay? Dito siya nagsimula, pinush niya yung pagkain, ngayon nandito na siya. Sa simula, ito yung nag-relax na portion, and later on, siya naman yung nag-contract. So it will progressively push the food away from the mouth and towards the direction of the anus. Okay, so that is number 1, ab-orad yung direction, and number 2, you have a contractile ring proximal to the bolus and receptive relaxation distal to the bolus. No? Those two components will make up the law of the gut. No? Ab-orad, and you have contractile ring proximal to the food, receptive relaxation distal to the food. Okay, and another type of movement which you will see in the gastrointestinal tract, particularly in the small and the large intestines, would be your segmentation contractions. So you have to understand that in the mouth, you have mechanical comminution or decrease in particle size of the food by virtue of the jaw muscles and the teeth. But as you go along the gastrointestinal tract, you have to understand again na nawawala yung voluntary control. What is left would be involuntary control. But your goal of decreasing the particle size is still in effect. Nandun pa, kailangan mo pang paliitin yung pagkain. No? But of course, wala na yun sa control mo. Now, there should be a particular movement of the small and large intestine to, in effect, decrease the particle size. No? Yung kanina, yung una nating diniscuss, here, would be how peristalsis occurs. But this movement, letter B, segmentation contractions, will be how the distal portions of the gastrointestinal tract decrease the size of the food. No? So, kung mapapansin nyo, iniipit niya lang. So, iipitin niya dito, papagalawin niya, then iipitin niya na naman. So, ipit, papagalaw, ipit, papagalaw. And eventually, that will lead to mixing of the food. No? This segment contracts, this segment relaxes. It moves, and this segment will again contract, and this segment will relax. And eventually, habang naiipit at namumove yung pagkain, lumiliit siya. No, yung particle size. So these are our segmentation contractions. So we have already discussed the basic layers of the gastrointestinal tract. No? So recall the layers. We have also discussed the basic movements or the basic contractile patterns in the gastrointestinal tract. No? We have peristalsis, the law of the gut, and segmentation contractions. Now, we will be looking at the actual organs themselves and what the special functions are in these particular organs. So first, the esophagus. Again, the esophagus is a conduit. It connects your mouth and your stomach. So it's a muscular wall. And again, the layers of the wall you will observe here. You have here the mucosa, the submucosa, and then you have here the outer longitudinal and inner circular, and then the peritoneum, especially the distal portion of the esophagus. It's covered peritoneum. The proximal portion of the esophagus, so if you will understand, if you're the mouth, the neck, the chest, and the abdomen, yung abdomen siya yung nag-hold ng stomach. But your esophagus spans the length, mouth, neck, chest or thorax, and abdomen. So there will be portions of the esophagus that are at the level of the heart and lungs. No? And of course, you won't see peritoneum there. So at those layers or at those levels, the esophagus is covered by serosa, no? Or adventitia. Okay. So dito sa mas distal na portion, nako-cover na siya ng peritoneum. So simple lang naman ng esophagus. It's made up of a muscular tube. And the function is to transfer the food from mouth into the stomach. Okay. So let's take a closer look at this portion. Here you will see the diaphragm, which is a muscle of breathing. What I'd like to emphasize here is that the diaphragm, together with its connective tissue, will supply connective tissue to this lower portion of the esophagus. No? Tawag dyan, in anatomical terms, would be the phrenico-diaphragm, esophageal esophagus, phrenico-esophageal ligament. And that ligament is made up of connective tissue. So that's the anatomical substrate. Yung ating physiologic counterpart of the phrenico-esophageal ligament would be the lower esophageal sphincter. Pag sinabi nating sphincter, siya ay isang structure na umiipit. No? Siya ay isang structure that provides constriction. So that lower esophageal sphincter is important because it has to relax so that the food can enter the stomach. And once the food is already in the stomach, it has to tonically contract so that food will not reflux out into the esophagus or back into the esophagus. So if your lower esophageal sphincter is unable to relax, then the food that is in the esophagus will not be able to go into the stomach. And as food continuously builds up in the esophagus, it will start to stretch the esophagus. And later on, if that process is not abated or not resolved, that will lead to a mega or big esophagus. No? Inability of the lower esophageal sphincter to relax will lead to mega esophagus. It will lead to difficulty swallowing. No? Kasi hindi nga nag-relax, hindi nag-receive, no, yung inyong lower esophageal sphincter. And therefore, you have there a disorder that you call achalasia. Yun yung tawag sa sakit na yun. Achalasia. Inability of the lower esophageal sphincter to relax. Okay? Kabaliktaran naman, if you have food already in the stomach and you have their acid secretion, no? And your lower esophageal sphincter is unable to tonically contract, food will reflux back into the esophagus. And that is what you call gastroesophageal reflux disease. So that is bad because the mucosa of the esophagus is unable to tolerate the acidic environment of the stomach, okay, of the gastric juice. So those are the two diseases. Okay. Here, in this picture, napapakita na already yung anatomy ng inyong stomach. No? You have here an abrupt change in the mucosa from the esophagus into the stomach. Okay, so makikita mo, mas mapula na siya. Okay, and that is because of the difference in the cells found in the mucosa. So this junction, the esophago-gastric junction, you will see a quick demarcation of the change in the mucosa from stratified squamous epithelium here in the esophagus to cuboidal to tall columnar epithelium or cells here in the gastric mucosa, which is adept in secreting acid. Okay? So ito yung inside layer, no, ng stomach. But what's special about this picture is that it also shows you how the muscles of the stomach are oriented. No? Meron kayong muscles na obliquely oriented. No? Oblique means slanted. And then you have circularly oriented. No? Then you have longitudinal. So yung stomach, it's special because it has many layers. Hindi lang dalawa yung layer ng muscles sa stomach. You have an inner circular, an intermediately oriented oblique muscle. Yan. And then another circular muscle, and then longitudinal. So maraming layers yun sa stomach. And that is consistent with the function of the stomach. No? Yung stomach kasi, it functions as a reservoir of food. Remember, it's a dilation of the gastrointestinal tract. From the esophagus, which is a slender tubular structure, pagdating sa stomach, magdadilate. No? And so because of that dilation, the stomach is able to handle food. The actual amount or capacity of the stomach is actually up to 2 liters. No? 2 liters in volume of food and fluid. Kaya niyang i-handle. Okay? So, kaya niya yung i-handle, but at the same time, yung stomach kayang mag-relax to accommodate more food, but at the same time, the stomach is able to contract rhythmically against the pylorus to be able to churn the food. So, yung churning of the food will serve to decrease the particle size of the food. No? So ano na yung mga processes na na-discuss natin that decreases the particle size of the food? You have chewing in the mouth, then dumaan yung pagkain ngayon sa esophagus, nasa stomach na siya. Pagdating niya sa stomach, initially, the stomach will expand, no, at the portion of the fundus so that it can receive the food that you've eaten. And then later on, as you digest the food, the stomach will contract, magsisqueeze yung walls ng stomach on a tonically closed pylorus, which I will show later. So habang nagko-contract to, ito sarado lang yung connection ng stomach to duodenum. Sarado lang siya. So can you imagine the food being pushed against the pylorus, which is closed? So habang ito ay nangyayari, sarado, bumubunggo dyan yung food, meron siyang resistance, that process will continuously shear the food, no? Para siyang iipitin. So as the food is sheared, its particle size decreases. So this is a picture from your book. And what this illustration shows you are the different portions or parts of the stomach. The part of the stomach which is in direct communication with the esophagus is called the cardia. No? It is also called the cardia because at this level, you will see the base of the heart. Okay? So you can check your other images in the internet showing you the relationship of the heart and the stomach. So at this portion, sobrang malapit na ang puso. Then you have here the fundus, which is the dome-shaped portion of the stomach. This fundus undergoes receptive relaxation. So when you eat, this is the one that relaxes so that you are able to accommodate the food. If the fundus does not relax and then you eat, you will not be able to accommodate the food. Therefore, you will have inability to eat food that is in the normal meal amounts. Kasi kapag kumakain ka ng, example, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, di ba bulto-bulto yun? So if your fundus does not relax, you won't be able to take in the amount which is in your plate. So that will manifest as dysphagia, no? Difficulty swallowing pa rin your food. Hindi siya tinatanggap ng tiyan. So that's the fundus. And this is the body of the stomach. Yan. And this is the pylorus that I was talking about a while ago. The pylorus is actually a thickening of the inner circular muscle layer. And because of this thickening, it will now provide an anatomic barrier or separation between the stomach and the duodenum. Just this one. Okay. So in between the body or the corpus of the stomach and the pylorus, you have here a receptacle, no, which is called the pyloric antrum. So here in the pyloric antrum, you will observe the churning of food. So the body of the stomach contracts, and then this peristaltic wave will continue towards the pylorus. But remember, the pylorus is tonically contracted, so that there is high pressure here. Then you have pressure building up from the food, no? And from the peristaltic ring, proximal to the food bolus, pushing it towards the pylorus. And this area, the antrum, is where you will see that churning effect, which will progressively and effectively comminute the food, no? Such that yung lalabas na lang sa inyong duodenum would be a bolus of food that is in liquid form, no? And that is already chyle, no? That is already okay. That is already chyle. So liquid na siya. And remember, yung kinain nyo solid, tapos paliit ng paliit yung particle size. It is already suspended in liquid. Therefore, you can just imagine the decrease in particle size and therefore the increase in surface area of the food, which will allow it to contact the walls of the small intestine, no? Contact the mucosa lining the walls of the small intestine. So para mo na siyang pinapahid sa walls. And therefore, habang pinapahid mo siya, the absorption becomes facilitated. Mas mabilis mo na siyang ma-absorb kasi ang liit na ng particle size. Okay, another particular or unique property of the stomach is that it is curved. No? You have here the lesser curvature and you have here the greater curvature. So yung lesser curvature occurs because during embryonic development, mas mabilis lumalaki itong side ng stomach na ito kaysa sa side na ito. Therefore, this will be longer, this will be shorter. This is the greater curvature and this is the lesser curvature. So that's for the relevant anatomy. But there are really more, no, that you can find out about the anatomy of the stomach. Ito, the lining, if you will observe, is highly folded. And this is what we call the gastric ruga, no, or the ruga of the stomach. If you take a closer look at the lining of the stomach, it will look like this one. And again, you will see that the layers of the stomach is conserved, no? Yung apat na layer na pinagsasabi natin kanina, it is conserved even in the stomach. You have here the mucosa, which is highly folded into ruga. And then you have here the submucosa. No? Yeah. And then you have here a muscularis mucosa. So ito, it is a thin layer of muscle, which you will find behind the mucosa. So this layer of muscle will contract and it will squeeze the mucosa. So that's how unique it is. Kahit mucosa na siya, na ang function ay mag-secrete at mag-absorb, meron pa ring muscle na mag-squeeze sa kanya. So that you have expression of glands and you have expression of absorbed fluid, no? Expression of glands so that it will squeeze out its secretions into the lumen. And you have squeezing so that yung na-absorb sa mucosa will be squeezed towards the side of the blood vessels for absorption. Okay. So if you take a closer look at this folded mucosa, you will see that we have pits. No? Ito yung pit. Ibig sabihin, parang cave or butas. No? So in the pit, you will already observe that you have here an opening, and then you have the neck and the base. So this structure is actually a gland in itself. So this is the gastric gland in the corpus of the stomach. You'll also observe in this image that the gland is made up of different kinds of cells. So you have here the superficial epithelial cell. You have here the mucous neck cells. Tinawag siyang mucous neck cell because it secretes mucus. that will progressively line, no, the stomach mucosa. So if this is the stomach mucosa, you will see mucus, no, or sipon lining this layer. Okay, and that sipon or mucus comes from the mucous neck cell. So sisecrete niya dyan yung mucus, the mucus will find its way outside, lining or coating the inner layer of the mucosa. Then you have here a stem cell, which can become either mucus cell or parietal cell or chief cell. This parietal cell here, yung yellow, is the one that secretes gastric acid. And the chief cells here, the one labeled purple, is the one that secretes digestive enzyme. So in the stomach, the digestive enzyme, which is secreted by your chief cell, is called pepsin. No? So what's special is that pepsin is a protein, it's a hydrolase. It performs hydrolysis of what? Of proteins. So pepsin helps digest proteins, and it is secreted by your chief cells, no? Which are found here in the gastric gland. Okay, so also special is that you have helping each other out, or cooperation of your parietal cell and chief cell. Remember that your parietal cell secretes acid and your chief cell secretes enzymes. So the acid that is secreted, the hydrochloric acid that is secreted by your parietal cell, activates the pepsinogen, which is secreted by your chief cells, so that it becomes the active pepsin, which is already able to digest the protein that you've eaten. Okay, and lastly, which we will later learn in our discussion of the endocrine system, we'll also find in the layers of the gastrointestinal tract cells that secrete hormones into the blood. And these hormones, in essence, will tell the endocrine system that, hey, endocrine system, I am encountering food right now, and I want you to do your job quicker and more efficiently because food is coming in. And I want you now to be ready to metabolize the food. Okay, so again, let me emphasize the important points of this slide, that this is the mucosa, the inner lining of the stomach, consistent with the 4 layers that we discussed of the alimentary tract. And the mucosa in the stomach contains glands, and these glands look like this one. They are arranged into pits, which are specialized for secretions. So this pit is actually a tissue, and it's made up of different kinds of cells. You have the surface epithelial cell, which is a lining cell. You have a mucous neck cell, which creates mucin or mucus that lines the layer of the mucosa, which prevents it from being destroyed by acid. You have parietal cells, which secrete acid, and chief cells, which secrete enzymes. The enzyme, particularly secreted by the chief cell of the gastric gland, is pepsinogen, and that pepsinogen is converted to pepsin, which is active and can already digest your protein, and that is activated by hydrochloric acid, which is secreted by your parietal cell. And lastly, you have endocrine cells, which will coordinate with the endocrine system. Now, this is an important topic, how the parietal cell secretes acid. So don't get overwhelmed by this picture because this is actually quite easy to understand. So you have here the lumen, which faces the food and where you secrete your acid into. Siya yung hollow space ng inyong stomach kung saan nandun yung food. And this pump right here is your proton pump. This is the primary protein that throws the acid into the lumen. Okay? And this proton pump is also known as the hydrogen, potassium, adenosine triphosphatase pump. So it will pump into the lumen acid or hydrogen cation in exchange for absorbing potassium. So you pump proton out into the lumen and you absorb potassium from the lumen back into the parietal cell. So ano siya? Siya yung central player natin sa acid secretion. Etong mga nangyayari sa loob ng cell, all of these will converge into the activation of the proton pump. So eto sila, mga processes lang yan sila kung paano nako-control, kung gaano ba kabilis yung pag-pump ng inyong proton pump. So at the end of the day, you throw into the lumen proton and you absorb from the lumen potassium. So tingnan natin kung paano gumagana itong mga, kung ano man yan, no? Yung mga intracellular signaling na nangyayari. So this is the luminal side or the apical side of your parietal cell. And this is the basolateral side of the parietal cell, which is in contact with the blood. Okay? So these are hormones. Eto, gastrin is a hormone, acetylcholine is a hormone, histamine is a hormone-like substance, somatostatin is a hormone, and prostaglandin, you can think of it also as a hormone. So what I want to emphasize here is that we have three main substances that will activate your proton pump, which will later cause increased acid secretion. You have acetylcholine, gastrin, and histamine. Again, three substances that activate the proton pump: histamine, acetylcholine, and gastrin. And they will act on their specific receptors, which are found on the basolateral side of the parietal cell. So at the end of the day, acetylcholine and gastrin will increase the levels of calcium inside the parietal cell. And this calcium will activate protein kinase C, which will increase the translocation of your proton pump into the apical side of the parietal cell. So, parang ganito siya. Sa simula, yung proton pump, nakatago pa siya sa loob ng parietal cell. And therefore, hindi pa siya nagpa-pump ng proton papunta sa lumen. And it's not yet pumping acid. But when you have an increase in calcium inside the parietal cell, that calcium will bind to the vesicles that contain your proton pump and cause these vesicles to go into the surface. Pag nasa surface na siya, in the apical surface, it will insert the proton pump into the surface and therefore cause the proton pump to be active. Okay, so that happens through this intracellular signaling. But at the end of the day, I want you to think it's the calcium. And that calcium will then activate your protein kinase, C, which will then cause an increase in the number of proton pumps. That same thing happens through histamine, but here you use a different mechanism. This histamine will activate intracellular metabolism so that at the end of the day, you have lots of cyclic adenosine monophosphate. And this cyclic adenosine monophosphate will again activate a protein kinase, which is called protein kinase A, which will then again cause the vesicles that hold your proton pump to insert into the lumen. And once in the lumen, what is the general step? Proton will be pumped into the lumen. So magtatapon ka ng acid sa lumen, then habang nagtapon ka ng acid, kukuha ka ng potassium. And that acid in the lumen, hydrogen ion, will combine with chloride to form hydrochloric acid. Okay? If hindi pa talaga naiintindihan, uulitin ko, ito yung parietal cell. It's part of your gastric gland. Okay? In the parietal cell, you have two sides of the cell. You have here the apical side, which faces the food, and you have the basolateral side, which faces the blood. So, central to the activity of the parietal cell, central to acid secretion is the proton pump. The proton pump functions by throwing proton into the lumen and reabsorbing potassium. The proton pump becomes more active. It secretes more acid when you have gastrin, acetylcholine, and histamine acting on their receptors, which are found in the basolateral aspect of the parietal cell. Okay. Again, what is the function of your acid? It will activate your pepsin and it will act as a catalyst in the stomach, causing digestion. So now, what I want to emphasize here would be the anatomy of your small intestines. In this image, the stomach has been cut out, and what is left for us to observe is the duodenum, which is this one. The duodenum is already the first part of the small intestines. It's called the duodenum because it refers to 12. Your duodenum is 12 inches long. Okay, so from here, you have here the pylorus again, which is the thickening of the inner circular muscle of the stomach. This is the duodenum. You have here this superior portion. You have here